Chapter 7. Nasty, Brutish, and Short. Illness and Early Death. Outstanding among these consequences is the virtual eradication or the effective control in many areas of communicable diseases spread by water, milk, and food, or transmitted by insects, rodents, and man himself, so that in countries like the United States, once dreaded diseases such as yellow fever, typhoid fever, diphtheria, and malaria are a thing of the past. George Rosen, 1958. Introduction. Previous chapters have traced the role of major inventions and their complementary follow-up innovations in raising the standard of living by providing new types of products and services that increased consumer welfare, raised the value of hours spent in leisure time activities, and reduced the drudgery and tedium of home production. This chapter examines another dimension of improvement, the set of developments that made possible increasing life expectancy, thus raising the number of years over which the new products and use of time could be enjoyed. During the 1870 to 1940 interval covered in Part 1 of this book, life expectancy improved at all ages, but most rapidly at birth. Because these years witnessed the near eradication of infant mortality. By several estimates, the value of reduced mortality, particularly of infants, was as great as the value of all the growth over the same period in market-purchased goods and services. Predictions of future economic progress from our current vantage point place major emphasis on continuing advances made possible by medical research, including the decoding of the genome and research using stem cells. It is often assumed that medical advances have moved at a faster pace since the invention of antibiotics in the 1930s and 1940s, the development from the 1970s of techniques of radiation and chemotherapy to fight cancer, and the advent of electronic devices such as the CT and MRI scans to improve diagnoses of many diseases. Many readers will be surprised to learn that the annual rate of improvement in life expectancy was twice as fast in the first half of the 20th century as in the last half. In the words of David Cutler and Grant Miller, together with the late 19th century, no other documented period in American history, as 1900 to 1940, witnessed such rapidly falling mortality rates. How was that epical improvement in life outcomes achieved? This chapter pulls together the many explanations. These include the development of urban sanitation infrastructure, including running water and separate sewer pipes, that were part of the networking of the American home that took place between 1870 and 1929, as discussed in Chapter 4. A contribution was made by Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease, which fostered public awareness about the dangers inherent in swarming insects and pools of stagnant water. The internal combustion engine deserves its share of credit for removing the urban horse and its prodigious and unrestrained outpouring of manure and urine onto city streets. Window screens invented in the 1870s contributed by creating a barrier in farmhouses to prevent insects from commuting back and forth between animal waste and the family dinner table. Government action at the local level built urban sanitation infrastructure, and at the national level, created the Food and Drug Administration. No period illustrates better than 1870 to 1940 that health and longevity depend on more than expenditures on doctors and hospitals. This theme is common today, as analysts speculate how much of the relatively low ranking of U.S. life expectancy in the world league tables results from factors that emerge from outside of the health industry sector, including obesity and smoking. Nevertheless, the role of the healthcare sector gradually became more important over time. The great achievement between 1870 and 1940 was the rapid reduction in the mortality rate of infants and children. In contrast, life expectancy at age 60 increased more rapidly after 1940 than before. This book views the household from the perspective of Gary Becker's economic theory of time. Households purchase market-produced goods and services and then combine them with their own time to produce the ultimate object that produces utility. For example, a home-cooked meal or an hour listening to the radio. Thus, within the utility function is a household production function in which goods, services, and time are inputs. Joel Mokyr and Rebecca Stein broaden this interpretation to apply to health. For them, the household production function produces not just enjoyment, but also good health as consumers purchase items such as soap or aspirin. Items such as tobacco can subtract from health. The same good can produce both enjoyment and bad health, including too much food, which produces obesity, and cigarette smoking, which produces lung cancer. In their interpretation, a significant part of the decline in mortality in the early 20th century resulted from improved knowledge about health at the level of the individual household. There is no dispute that, however the improvements in life expectancy are achieved, they are of great value. The studies we examine agree that the values are stunning, even if the experts may differ on whether health advances at any given time would raise estimates of per capita GDP growth by 50% or 100%. The value of reducing infant mortality is greater than of improving the life expectancy of a 65-year-old, and this implies that improvements in health contributed a larger addition to household welfare before 1940 than after. Improvements in the standard of living are measured not just by changes in life expectancy, but also by QALYs, or quality-adjusted life years, which attempt to convert into a quantitative measure the results of medical interventions. The central task of this chapter is not just to explain the rapid increase in life expectancy from 1870 to 1940, but also to identify aspects of change that improved the quality of life beyond the reduction in mortality. The first step is to quantify progress along the dimensions of life expectancy at different ages, death rates, and causes of death. The next sections search for the causes of improvement. Possible candidates include progress made outside the health sector, including diet, nutrition, running water and sewers, food and drug regulation, and a reduction in both industrial accidents and violence. Within the health sector, we credit the early pharmaceuticals, starting with aspirin and advances in medical technology, including the early X-ray machines. We ask, what did doctors and hospitals do in those early years when drugs were few and medical knowledge was primitive? The transformation of healthcare can be dated to the same 50-year period between 1890 and 1940, when so much else was revolutionized in the American standard of living, as hospitals joined other new institutions, such as the hotel, the factory, the club, the opera, the symphony, the theater, the high school, and the university, in taking roughly their modern-day form. Never matched before or since, dimensions of improvement, 1870 to 1940. There was no improvement in either mortality rates or life expectancy before 1870. And in most data series, there was no improvement before 1890. In 1870 to 79, male life expectancy at age 20 was identical to that in 1750 to 79, and that for females was actually lower. The central fact in the improvement of life expectancy was the decline of infant mortality, as shown in Figure 7.1. The rate of 215 per 1,000 births for 1880 was unchanged from rates in the range of 200 to 250 reported as far back as Tudor England. There was no improvement between 1850 and 1880, followed by a steep decline from 1890 to 1950, and then a much lower rate of decline after 1950. The historic decline in infant mortality centered in the 6-decade period of 1890 to 1950 and is one of the most important single facts in the history of American economic growth. Out of every 1,000 births, the number of lives saved by improvements from 1880 to 1950 was 188, and the additional number saved from 1950 to 2010 was a mere 21. That life expectancy did not begin its historic ascent until 1890 is consistent with substantial evidence that conditions deteriorated before that year. Robert Higgs concludes, "There is little evidence that mortality in the mid-19th century countryside was markedly lower than it had been a century earlier." Roderick Floud, Robert Fogel, and their co-authors document that life expectancy at age 10 declined steadily between 1790 and 1850, remained on a plateau until 1880, and only then began to improve. Life expectancy at birth also stagnated between 1850 and 1880, only to march steadily higher after that year. Consistent with this view of a late-century takeoff is evidence compiled by the same authors on human heights, which indicate a steady decline between those born in the 1830 decade to those born in the 1890 decade, followed by a steady increase that was at its most rapid between 1890 and 1930. There is separate evidence that life expectancy in Massachusetts improved more during the 30 years 1890 to 1920 than in the entire century before 1890. Historical studies have consistently found higher mortality rates and lower life expectancy in urban areas than in rural areas. Food consumed on farms was fresher, whereas food was often contaminated by the time it reached urban consumers. Contagious diseases spread faster when people lived closer together in cities. The effect of standing water in breeding disease-carrying insects was greater than on farms, and the airless, poorly ventilated, and often windowless rooms in tightly packed urban tenements contributed to illness and death. By one estimate, life expectancy at birth in 1900 was 46 years for white rural males and 39.1 years for white urban males, with the rural to urban differential about half that for white females. Urbanization moved people from lower to higher mortality regimes, exacting a price for the increased economic opportunity of the city. The very industrialization of the late 19th century made air and water pollution greater threats than before. Earth was scarred by mining pits and railway tracks. Air was fouled and darkened by factory soot. Water was polluted by industrial wastes or ran unchecked down eroded mountains once covered by forests. Americans became imperialists within their own nation. Figure 7.2 highlights the quite different rates of improvement in life expectancy at birth, with life expectancy at higher ages ranging up to age 70. The chart shows the point of inflection at 1950, after which life expectancy at birth radically slowed from its previous rate of ascent. But life expectancy viewed from each older age improves much less, and this is the direct corollary to the conquest of infant mortality as part of overall life expectancy improvement. Whereas life expectancy at birth increased at twice the rate during 1890 to 1950, as during 1950 to 98, 0.32 years of annual improvement versus 0.15 years. The relationship was reversed for life expectancy at age 70, 0.03 versus 0.05 years annually for the two intervals. After Americans made it through childhood, their life expectancy did not increase radically over time. We are reminded of one of those bizarre coincidences of American history. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, on the exact 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams at the grand old age of 90, and Jefferson aged 83. Though infant mortality was shockingly high by modern standards, Americans who survived early childhood, even in the 18th century, had the potential to live as long as Jefferson and Adams. Another way of dramatizing the role of infant mortality in contributing to the increase of life expectancy is to plot survival rates. Of 100 people born, how many survived to each age, from age 1 to age 80? 3 sets of survival rates are plotted in Figure 7.3, those for 1870, 1940, and 1997. The lower 1870 line clearly shows the devastating role of infant mortality in reducing survival by age 5 to 75%, as compared to 94% in 1940 and 99% in 1997. Also shown is that half of the 1870 group were dead by age 50, whereas the 50% survival rate did not occur until age 67 in the 1940 group, and not until age 77 in the 1997 group. Kevin Murphy and Robert Topel have captured this dramatic improvement with a simple factual comparison. In 1900, nearly 18% of males born in the United States died before their first birthday. Today, cumulative mortality does not reach 18% until age 62. Mortality was consistently lower in the northern states than in the South, and it was also lower for Southern whites than non-whites. The lingering effects of slavery and post-Civil War poverty and discrimination resulted in 1900 life expectancies at birth for both non-white males and non-white females that were 16 to 17 years shorter than for their white equivalents. By 1940, this difference had narrowed markedly. Life expectancy at birth for white males had increased from 48 to 63 between 1900 and 1940, and for non-white males from 33 to 52, for a reduction in the gap from 15 to 11 years. Still very substantial. For females, the gap declined over the same period from 16 years to 12 years. One reason for the shorter life expectancy of non-whites was the explicit Jim Crow policy of denying non-white areas of cities and non-white rural areas the modern improvements of running water and sanitary sewage disposal provided to whites. Other chapters have emphasized the unprecedented pace of change in the living conditions of Americans in the decades after 1870. The same appears to be true for the mortality rate of the 75% of Americans classified as rural in 1870. In the 40 years, 1870 to 1910, the rural death rate declined by between 30% and 40%, as stated by Robert Higgs. In a half-century after 1870, nothing less than a vital revolution occurred in the American countryside. It is highly unlikely that a long-term mortality decline of this proportion could ever have occurred in American history before 1870. Water cometh, and sewers taketh away, a central source of mortality improvement. Douglas Eubank and Robert Preston highlight the central issue about declining mortality. Death is a biological event, and all influences must ultimately affect mortality from biological variables. Their analysis of the decline of infant mortality is equally concise. The dominant biological variables affecting infant and child mortality in the United States a century ago are exposure to infectious diseases and human responses to that exposure. Even before the formal development of the Pasteur theory of disease and the related discoveries of treatments for specific infectious diseases, there was a widespread belief that cities were unhealthy places. Authors in 1858 described an urban world that was condemned to poor health and death. The crowded, narrow tenements to which avarice drives poverty, in filthy streets and noisome courts, become perennial sources of deadly miasmata that may be wafted to the neighboring mansions of wealth and refinement, to cause sickness and mourning there, and when once the breath of pestilence becomes epidemic in any city, commerce and trade are driven to more salubrious marts. During the pre-1940 era, improvements in medical care by doctors and hospitals played a relatively small role in the decline of mortality rates and the accompanying increases in life expectancy at birth. Higgs concluded that changes in medical practice during the period 1870 to 1920 could, at best, have contributed only negligibly to the decline in the rural crude death rate. The most outspoken proponents of this view are John and Sonia McKinley, who plot a figure similar to Figure 7.4, which we have updated from their 1972 termination date to 2009. Our updated version plots the overall mortality rate, as well as the rate minus the contribution of 8 infectious diseases. The first conclusion is that more than 37% of deaths in 1900 were caused by infectious diseases, but by 1955, this had declined to less than 5% and to only 2% by 2009. In contrast, over the same period, the percentage of deaths caused by 3 chronic conditions, heart disease, strokes, and cancer, increased from 7% to 60%. The second conclusion is that almost all of the decline in the infectious mortality rate had been achieved by 1955, which is before the share in GDP of medical care spending began its inexorable rise from 4% in the mid-1950s to 17% by 2010. A central question of this chapter is whether the chief causes of the decline in mortality before 1940 had anything to do with drugs, doctors, and hospitals. And if not, what set of factors caused the decline? Before that question is addressed, note should be made of the sharp spike in Figure 7.4 in deaths from infectious diseases that occurred in 1918 to 19, interrupting the otherwise relatively smooth decline. Fully 675,000 Americans died in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 19, a relatively small fraction of the estimated global mortality toll of 20 million to 50 million, which far exceeded fatalities caused by World War I. The precise cause of the pandemic was never determined, the study of viruses being in its infancy at the time. It was not until 1933 that the influenza A virus was isolated, and not until 1944 that the first influenza vaccine was introduced. The Spanish nickname for the pandemic came about because wartime censors limited reporting to preserve public morale, and the wartime neutrality of Spain meant that much of the influenza news came from that country, leading to belief that Spain had been the origin of the event. Leaving aside the 1918 to 19 flu pandemic, the conquest of infectious diseases proceeded gradually over the first half of the 20th century. The McKinleys compare the timing of the decline in mortality from each infectious disease with the introduction of the medical intervention designed to treat that ailment, for instance, penicillin and other vaccines. Their finding is striking, that most of the decline in mortality from the major diseases, particularly tuberculosis and influenza, had already occurred before the introduction of the medical intervention. Their conclusion is that 3.5% probably represents a reasonable upper limit estimate of the total contribution of medical measures to the decline in mortality in the United States since 1900. Edward Meeker agrees with the McKinleys that the main drivers of the decline in the death rate, which for him begins around 1885, were the taming of the infectious diseases. Meeker rejects as causes either improvements in medical practice or genetic changes in the virulence of disease organisms. Instead, his searchlight beams in on the crucial improvements in public health, such as the urban sanitation infrastructure, largely consisting of filtered central water supplies and sanitary sewers, as were emphasized in Chapter 4 as part of the development of the networked home in urban America between 1870 and 1940. Meeker provides data on the sharp decline in the incidence of typhus in 20 American cities after a filtered water supply was introduced. The importance of a pure water supply was not a new idea. From time immemorial, the human race had recognized that if health was to be maintained, such bodily wastes as urine and feces must be kept rigidly separated from food and drink. The importance of water piped under pressure to homes and businesses is often neglected in the history of the great inventions. Chapter 4 focused on the role of water in creating the networked house and the associated reduction of the drudgery of the water carrying by housewives, who were previously forced to carry literally tons of water per year in their function as a beast of burden to provide the family's water supply. In this section, we link the provision of running water and sanitary sewage systems to the decline in mortality rates in the first half of the 20th century. Beyond personal convenience and health, there are further uses of widely available running water that may be overlooked or forgotten, and they suggest the reasons why towns competed to achieve a fully distributed water supply. Perhaps the most important public use of a water supply is the extinguishing of fires. Other than important public uses are in street sprinkling and sewer flushing, in furnishing water for public buildings, and for drinking and ornamental fountains. All the benefits accruing from a good water supply act indirectly to increase the desirability of a town for many purposes, and to enhance the value of the property therein. The years 1890 to 1940 were the period when the spread of filtered running water and sanitary sewer pipes reached its fastest pace. The percentage of urban households supplied with filtered water grew slowly at first, from 0.3% in 1880 to 1.5% in 1890 and 6.3% in 1900. But then came the great rush of construction of waterworks, bringing the urban percentage up to 25% by 1910 and to 42% by 1925. According to the first census of housing, see Table 4.4, by 1940, fully 93% of urban households had running water, and 83% had sole use of an indoor toilet. The great increase of running filtered water availability in urban America, from 25% in 1910 to 93% in 1940, contradicts the claim by Mokier and Stein that by 1914 running water was basically universal. Without agreeing with their timing, we concur with these authors' conclusion that it was finally water that conquered us by transforming the world and becoming part of our daily life. Higgs contrasts the central role of water, sewers, and public health initiatives in urban America with the lack of these improvements in rural America. The rural population continued to obtain its water supplies from traditional sources, shallow wells, springs, and cisterns in most cases. Milk escaped pasteurization, and the privy continued to provide the same primitive means of human waste disposal. In short, the public health movement that triumphed in the larger American cities between 1890 and 1920 almost completely bypassed the countryside. In fact, the initial motivation in rural settings for a supply of running water was protection against fires, with no concern for the purity of the water. The rural population depended on wells and rivers well after the 1940 census that certified the ubiquity of running water in urban America. Historians attribute the spread of water and sewer infrastructure not to any technological revolution, but to a changing set of priorities, including the discovery that several diseases were spread by unsanitary water, as well as to the increasing wealth that allowed the investment to be financed, and the example of Europe, which was well ahead, having substantial infrastructure completed by 1875. Another impetus was the Memphis yellow fever epidemic of 1878, which killed 10% of the city's population. Though soon thereafter the cause was identified as mosquitoes, the cause in 1878 was unknown, even as the effects were universal, including jaundice and the failure of the liver and kidneys, and victims literally turned yellow and died in agony. Early municipal water systems were not a panacea and did not prevent many types of waterborne diseases, as animal waste deposited on the streets was pushed by street cleaners into drains and ultimately into municipal water supplies. Sewers of many cities, either on rivers or on the Great Lakes, emptied into bodies of water that were the source of drinking water. It was one thing for families to change their attitude toward the disease-preventing virtues of cleanliness in the late 19th century. It was another to achieve it, and here the transition to running hot and cold water and the indoor bathroom became central. The perceived cost of taking a shower today is trivial. 2 or 3 minutes of standing under running hot water with soap in hand. It was far different before indoor plumbing, when a bath was taken in a large metal container, after a tedious process of carrying water into the home and heating it. The primary goal of the public health movement of the late 19th century was to create universal clean water supplies and sewage systems. In fact, clean water technologies have been labeled as likely the most important public health intervention of the 20th century. Empirical research based on a comparison of cities in 1890 and 1900 shows that the extent of construction of waterworks, measured by miles of waterworks per person and per acre, have a significant negative correlation, not just with infant mortality, but also with adult mortality. During this period, 80% of the decline in the total mortality rate is accounted for by 4 categories: diarrheal diseases, typhoid, tuberculosis, and diphtheria. Cutler and Miller date the major advance of chlorination to the years between 1906 and 1918, and of filtration to 1906 to 1922. This coincides with the extremely rapid decline in the death rate from typhoid fever, a primarily waterborne disease, by a factor of 5 between 1900 and 1920. Before 1910, water was ample, but it was hardly pure. Home filters had been available since the mid-1850s, but did not become common items in the home until the 1870s. These authors estimate that clean water filtration and chlorination systems explain half of the overall reduction in mortality between 1900 and 1936, as well as 75% of the decline in infant mortality and 67% of the decline in child mortality. Pasteur's germ theory and the transition from adulteration to regulation. Even the Cutler-Miller results leave room for a complementary set of additional explanations of the reduction in mortality before 1940, beyond the rapid diffusion of urban sanitation infrastructure. There were other goals of the public health movement besides clean water and sewers, including general street cleaning, improvements in slum housing, inspections of food and milk, use of quarantine and disinfection practices, and the distribution of diphtheria antitoxin. A set of scientific discoveries together have been called the Pasteur Revolution, in which during 1880 to 1900, pathogenic organisms were discovered at the average rate of 1 a year. Experiments in the latter decades of the 19th century identified the bacterial causes of numerous diseases, a scientific revolution that occurred with amazing speed. Although much of the initial research had been carried out in Germany, by 1900, the United States became a leader in the implementation of preventative measures against germ disease. Public health laboratories containing a diagnostic bacteriological laboratory had been established in most states and cities. A laboratory established in New York City in 1892 within 2 years had developed the first diphtheria antitoxin, and within 2 decades, an effective vaccination program had been developed that led to a reduction in the death rate from 785 per 100,000 in 1984 to only 1.1 per 100,000 in 1950. A major cause of death had been completely wiped out within 60 years. Soon research extended to the bacterial causes of tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, and the role of milk in disease. Not only did the arrival of clean running water help conquer waterborne diseases, but it also improved the cleanliness of the home and of the family itself. When water had to be hand-carried into the house, baths with recycled water were, at best, a Saturday night luxury. Gradually, the washtub was replaced by full adult-sized bathtubs that could be easily filled with water, although that water had to be heated on the stove until the apartment building or house was equipped with an automatic water heater. Among the supplementary explanations was the effect of the Pasteur theory on the behavior of parents, especially mothers. Mokier and Stein develop a production-function approach to the understanding of declining mortality, which combines the external effects of the environment to the household's own choices in combining market-purchased goods and services and household time into the achievement of health outcomes. In this framework, changes in the external environment include the availability of clean water and sanitary sewers, as well as the reduction of animal waste on the streets, as a cleaner environment was achieved by the transition from horses to motor vehicles. Changes in the quality of market-purchased food, including the reduction in contamination and adulteration, would be included in the environment external to the household. Another aspect of the late 19th century environment was air pollution. Chicago's concentration of industrial plants led to the description, "The smoke has a peculiar aggressive individuality." Rudyard Kipling was blunt about Chicago when he said, "Having seen it, I desire urgently never to see it again. Its air is dirt." The largest stockyards in the world added a pungent flavor to Chicago's air. In Kansas City, the confusion and stench of patrolling hogs were so penetrating that Oscar Wilde observed, "They made granite eyes weep." New York City was not immune from the observation that no dumping ground, no sewer, no vault contains more filth or in greater variety than does the air in certain parts of New York City during the long season of drought. No barrier can shut it out. No social distinction can save us from it. No domestic cleanliness, no private sanitary measures can substitute a pure atmosphere for a foul one. Within the household's set of choices are improved knowledge about the relationship between purchased goods and uses of time and better health outcomes. This would include shifting purchases to buying more soap and disinfectants to minimize the presence of germs and infections, as well as keeping babies as far away as possible from other family members suffering from any infectious disease. Though the health advantages of breastfeeding had long been known, the practice had new appeal as a means of insulating the baby from infection caused by impure milk and water. Mokyr and Stein emphasized the role of learning and public education in creating these behavioral changes that hastened the decline of infant mortality. Food spoilage and adulteration was not an ancient problem suddenly addressed after 1890, but rather a new problem, created by industrialization itself. Before 1870, when Americans mainly lived on farms and in small towns, much of the food was either grown at home or purchased from neighbors. Each household could take steps to protect itself from spoilage and contamination. But as America urbanized, more of the food was produced in factories and shipped long distances in a world in which mechanical refrigeration had not yet been invented. Avarice and greed by food manufacturers, combined with new chemical processes that could accomplish the adulteration and disguise the results with coloring agents. Consumers were helpless, for most food items were subject to adulteration. Only by purchasing alternative brands, tasting them, and observing the results could consumers begin to make an informed choice, because so few unadulterated products were available. About milk adulteration, a cynic once remarked, "A water shortage would put the milkman out of business. All dealers required was a water pump to boost 2 quarts of milk to a gallon. To improve the color of milk from diseased cattle, they frequently added molasses, chalk, or plaster of Paris." The dangers posed by market-purchased milk were significant because of adulteration with polluted water. As late as 1900, the nation's milk supply was seriously contaminated with tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and streptococcal germs. Even beer and alcoholic drinks were adulterated. A retired brewer in Rochester, New York revealed that salicylic acid, quassia wood, tannin, glycerin, and grape sugar were added to his firm's beer during its processing. A retired liquor manufacturer in New York City told a reporter, "A man stands about as good a chance of being struck by lightning as of buying pure brandy in New York." Anticipating Upton Sinclair's unsettling exposé of the Chicago stockyards in 1906, the New York Council of Hygiene reported in 1869 that foods hung on racks or placed on counters undergo spontaneous deterioration, becoming absolutely poisonous. In the early 1880s, little progress had been made. Much of New York City's meat supply reached the stockyards afoot through labyrinths of residential streets, strewing manure and trailing clouds of dust and flies. The remainder came from diseased cows fed on distillery swill in the city's notoriously filthy dairies. Children reveled and played downstream in ditches, which drained the slaughterhouses. Progress was gradually made in the 1880s and 1890s to clean up these foul conditions, an achievement of one of the first political movements in American history, led by women. The New York's Ladies Protective Health Association, LPHA, established in 1884, was soon joined by similar organizations in a nationwide reform movement to force slaughterhouse owners to make drastic reforms. And this political pressure was resisted fiercely by lobbying and political contributions by the owners, who were eventually defeated by the influence of public opinion on legislation. The grand climax of the fight between the reformers and the abusive, profit-oriented suppliers of adulteration and contamination came suddenly. In February 1906, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was published, a semi-fictionalized account of health and working conditions in the Chicago stockyards. The Jungle was intended by Sinclair to be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the labor movement. Barely 20 years after the revelations of conditions in New York by the LPHA, the details about Chicago were even more sickening. The meat, quote, without being washed, was pushed from room to room in rotten box carts, all the while collecting dirt, splinters, floor filth, and the expectoration of tubercular and other diseased workers. The book became an instant bestseller, and because it accused federal meat inspectors of taking bribes, it immediately caught the attention of President Theodore Roosevelt, who launched an investigation. The in-person inspection by top federal officials, including the U.S. Commissioner of Labor, reported back that conditions were nearly as bad as Sinclair had depicted. The brief interval between the discovery of the abuse and the proposal of its cure may have set a record for speed in the history of U.S. regulation, as the political remedy came within a few weeks. After the release of the government report and the shocked commentary of the nation's newspapers in early June 1906, trade in lard, sausage, and canned goods came almost to a standstill. Restaurants reported a vast decline in business. Almost instantly by June 30th, Congress had passed, and Roosevelt had signed into law, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which established the ancestor of today's Food and Drug Administration. Newspapers and other publications hailed the act as the most important piece of legislation ever passed by Congress. Commentators trace the epical legislation back at least 2 decades. But Sinclair's book was clearly the catalyst that made the legislation possible sooner rather than later. Sinclair's novel struck such a chord because it confirmed and publicized what people already knew or suspected about commercialized food and drugs. The Jungle was merely the final spectacular fictionalized climax to the long agitation by patient investigators, women's organizations, food chemists, journalists, and other reformers and altruists. During the years after passage of the act, progress was slow, as inspectors had to be hired and trained, and food manufacturers did everything they could to delay the act's full implementation. States and local governments gradually passed their own legislation and implemented rules and inspections. The widespread acceptance of the Pasteur germ theory of disease led to an increased emphasis on cleanliness at every stage of food production, from slaughterhouses to every other type of food producer, retailer, restaurant, and saloon. The scope of disease prevention broadened to include control of insects, replacement of open buckets with modern sanitary water fountains, and banning of spitting in public. Pharmacies and the taming of the Wild West of drug distribution. Our image of drug purchases during the late 19th century is one of a Wild West frontier in which customers could obtain any kind of drug freely over the counter without the intervention of a doctor's prescription. Pharmacies were virtually unregulated before 1870. Drug adulteration was reputedly so common that doctors customarily prescribed excessive dosages on the assumption that the medication's strength had been substantially reduced. The ready availability of drugs from pharmacies elevated the position of pharmacists relative to doctors. Pharmacies sold three different classes of drugs to consumers. The first group consisted of the reputable drugs that are recognized even today as having a valid therapeutic benefit, including not just aspirin, but morphine, quinine, and diphtheria antitoxin. The second group consisted of the patent medicines that were heavily advertised to provide miracle cures, yet that contained little more than colored water and alcohol. The third group included the narcotics, other than morphine, that are largely banned today but that were widely available in 1900, such as opium, cocaine, and heroin. There was some overlap between the second and third group, for some patent medicines included opium as an ingredient. By the 1880s, Chinese immigrants, originally recruited to build the first transcontinental railway, had established Chinese enclaves in San Francisco and elsewhere and set up opium dens, spreading addiction to the native population. Not just opium and its derivatives, but also cocaine were common treatments over the 1880 to 1930 interval for treating pain, easing sleep, reducing coughs, and curing other medical ailments. Because drugs did not require prescriptions, the pharmacist had an exalted position and was expected to diagnose the customer's ailments. Few druggists could resist the temptation to sell to the customer the most profitable drugs that they resold or created on their own by combining ingredients. The most potent emerging competition for the pharmacists was the availability of many drugs, particularly patent medicines, at lower costs through mail-order catalogs. In this chaotic world so unfamiliar to us today, any drug that could be obtained with a doctor's prescription could also be obtained without a prescription. But doctors' prescriptions provided a promotional value to pharmacists, even though they could dispense the same drugs without prescriptions. When a patient arrived with a prominent doctor's prescription for a particular drug, pharmacists could advertise that particular medicine as a cure-all that had been endorsed by Dr. Famous. And yet, because they had no monopoly on the writing of prescriptions, doctors could sell drugs directly to patients in their offices, add to their incomes as doctors, and thus undermine the business of pharmacists. There was also a symbiotic relationship in the late 19th century between newspapers and drug companies. The drugs were widely advertised in newspapers, and in appreciative return, the newspapers suppressed coverage of any dangers or side effects created by use of the drugs. In the 1880s and 1890s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, better known for its fight against alcohol, became the leading organization that crusaded against addictive drugs of all types. One of its pamphlets in 1898 claimed that the United States seemed to be radically becoming a nation of cocaine fiends, and that physicians were careless, selfish, unprincipled, or unobservant. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act took the first steps to regulate drug marketing. Any product containing alcohol, morphine, cocaine, heroin, or cannabis had to be explicitly labeled, but was not prohibited. From 1914 to the 1930s, additional legislation and enforcement effectively banned all these drugs, including alcohol, under the prohibition legislation in force between 1920 and 1933. Before 1940, there were not many effective drugs, and those that were marketed dealt with surface symptoms without effectiveness in curing underlying conditions. In that era, pharmacists actually compounded the ingredients of drugs instead of merely reselling drugs manufactured by large pharmaceutical firms. Trial and error by consumers had more effect on purchase decisions than any influence of government regulation. The rate of discovery of effective pharmaceutical drugs increased rapidly after the 1935 discovery of sulfonamide drugs and penicillin during World War II. Because most of the effects of this acceleration were felt after 1940, it is treated in Chapter 14. The regulatory environment was radically changed by the successor to the 1906 Food and Drug legislation, which was passed in 1938 after years of debate. The first important change was the requirement that the FDA approve the introduction of newly developed drugs. The second was perhaps even more radical, requiring doctors' prescriptions for many commonly used drugs. This utterly changed from the previous world, in which drug companies had no reason to advertise to doctors, to a new world in which doctors were showered in advertisements, traveling drug salespeople, and abundant samples. The modern world of drug regulation and the new distinction between the rights of pharmacists and doctors to determine the availability of drugs began in 1938, conveniently close to our 1940 transition year from Part 1 to Part 2 of this book. And the 1938 legislation still serves as the foundations of FDA regulation today. What did doctors do? The period 1850 to 1930 witnessed the consolidation of professional authority of doctors, as their own ignorance and refusal to learn from scientific discoveries yielded to a consensus practice of modern medicine. If national accounts were available in detail for the late 19th century, the medical care industry would be almost invisible. Most medical care did not even take place in the market economy, but rather at home and across households as neighbors helped neighbors. Indeed, in 1929, total expenditures on health care of all types amounted to only 2.3% of GDP, compared to 16.6% in 2013. Perspective on the limited role of the former medical sector is provided by the fact that 75% of the American population was rural in 1870, living on farms or in small towns, having populations of less than 2,500. Farms were far apart, and the small towns were far apart from each other. Many rural towns were too small to support a doctor of their own, and the high cost of transportation put a natural limit on the availability of medical care achieved through doctors' house calls. Doctor fees included not just a basic charge for a home visit, but also a per-mile charge to compensate the doctor for his trip by buggy to the farm patient. One doctor complained about the endless travel, claiming that he spent half of his life in the mud and the other half in the dust. In the absence of doctors, most rural areas had midwives to deliver babies and women, usually unpaid, who specialized in tending the sick. Most pioneers' first response to sickness was to employ folk remedies and tender loving care. The local general store provided staples of frontier medicine, such as opium tincture for pain. Another popular drug for the relief of physical and mental pain was whiskey. For indigestion, a solution of rhubarb bitters or cayenne pepper mixed with whiskey was rubbed into the abdomen, often combined with whiskey and water taken internally. As motor vehicles replaced horse-drawn buggies, and as people grouped together closer in cities, the reduced cost of transportation brought more market-produced services into reach. Getting a haircut, visiting a prostitute, and consulting a doctor all became, on the average, less expensive because of the reduced cost of time. Perhaps no other profession than the medical doctors embraced the automobile so enthusiastically. Besides making house calls in one half the time, wrote a physician from Oklahoma, there is something about the auto that is infatuating, and the more you ride, the more you want to ride. Medical care provides an example of the consumer benefits of the invention of the telephone. Before the telephone reached the farm, extra travel was required by a relative or friend of the patient who had to go and fetch the doctor in person. In many cases, the doctor could not be found because he was out on another call. and the emissary would have to wait or frantically try to find out where the doctor had traveled. The telephone was essential in the organization of office visits, allowing patients to phone in advance for appointments, and allowing the doctor to become more efficient by packing his schedule with prearranged rather than unexpected visits by patients. In 1870, there were virtually no specialist surgeons. One surgeon said in 1876 that it was safe to affirm that there is not a medical man on this continent who devotes himself exclusively to the practice of surgery. Seemingly, insurmountable problems held back the development of surgery, including patient pain resulting from the absence of reliable anesthetics and the high death rate caused by post-operative sepsis, caused in part by unsterile procedures and the lack of antiseptics. The presence of many patients who had open wounds in large wards led to cross-infection from one patient to another. This is an example of the deterioration of health caused by urbanization, because city hospitals were much more crowded and were much more likely to have large wards than rural private homes. Throughout the 1870 to 1940 period, activities shifted from home production to market purchases. Medical care also made a transition from home self-sufficiency to house calls by itinerant doctors to office visits, and finally to hospital treatment. During this period, the most basic common tools of doctors were developed, including the stethoscope, ophthalmoscope, and laryngoscope. The prototype of contemporary blood pressure instruments, involving the pumping of air into a rubber bag wrapped around the upper arm, was developed by an Italian physician in 1896, only a few months after Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of the properties of X-rays and the first use of an X-ray machine. Soon thereafter, in 1901, a Dutch physiologist invented the electrocardiogram, which began to be widely used in the 1920s. We can erect signposts to measure progress of the medical profession in 1876, 1901, and 1926. The situation in 1901 was little better than described earlier for the decade of the 1870s. Doctors were still engaged in destructive debates about homeopathy and other types of unconventional quack medicine. They felt assaulted by pharmacists who provided free medical advice and who used their prescriptions to become self-promoting prescribers of particular drugs recommended by Dr. X. They faced competition from too many doctors, many of whom had been produced by disreputable profit-making medical schools lacking in standards. The problems perceived in 1926 were very different from those in 1876 and 1901. Doctors had become a respected profession, earning a substantial income. Disreputable medical schools had been closed, reducing competition from improperly trained doctors. Licensing laws had restricted competition from pharmacists and inadequately trained physicians. The medical profession had turned hospitals, drug manufacturers, and public health from threats to its position into bulwarks of support. In short, it had helped shape the medical system so that its structure supported professional sovereignty instead of undermining it. But problems remained. At the top of the list was the maldistribution of doctors, who were abandoning rural communities faster than those small towns and farms were shrinking as a share of the national population. Furthermore, thanks to an improvement in the standards of medical schools after 1900, fewer doctors per capita had made their way through medical school, so the generation of doctors educated under the lax standards of the 1890s was starting to die out. Thus, for the roughly half of the population that was still classified as rural in 1926, medical knowledge may have been abundant, but the medical practitioners to apply the knowledge were increasingly absent, a situation described at the time as ranging from serious to desperate. Figure 7.5 displays the number of doctors per 10,000 people from 1850 to 2009, as well as the number of hospital beds per 10,000 people from 1910 to 2009. reflecting the retirement of doctors who were trained before the tightening of professional standards. The ratio for doctors declined from a peak of 17.6 in the 1850s to 12.5 in 1929. The ratio was roughly constant at 13.3 between 1940 and 1959, and then increased to 16.9 in 1970, 25.6 in 1990, and 31.6 in 2009. The inexorable upward creep of the physician's ratio evident in Figure 7.5 reflects the growing number of specialties and the increased relative income of doctors that was in turn a partial cause of the unrelenting increase in medical care expenses that began after 1955, and that is discussed in Chapter 14. The history of hospital beds per 10,000 people shows a modest inverse relationship with the physician ratio. The development of antiseptics and anesthesia in the late 19th century made hospitals a more acceptable place to go for medical cures. The hospital beds ratio exhibits a doubling from 47 in 1910 to 93 in 1940, followed by a temporary bulge during World War II, when additional beds were temporarily needed to treat the wounded. The beds ratio declined in the post-war years thanks to the declining role of hospitals in long-term care, some of which was transferred to nursing homes and mental health facilities. Increased efficacy of treatment, which made shorter stays possible, and the increased relative price of hospital care, which led patients to seek other types of medical care. The hospital, from a cesspool for the indigent to curing disease. In some ways, the large urban hospital of 1870 was more akin to modern-day nursing homes than to today's large teaching and research hospitals. Between 1870 and 1920, the hospital was transformed from an asylum for the poor into something resembling the modern hospital, as its numbers multiplied from only 120 in 1873 to 6,000 by 1920. The reputation of hospitals was gradually changed from repositories of filth and infection to clean places where advanced medical care was practiced. But in the 1870s and 1880s, the hospital was little changed from the previous century, regarded as a dumping ground for the lower classes and impoverished immigrants, a place where a patient was likely to fall victim to sepsis. An 1872 visitor to Bellevue Hospital in New York reported, "The loathsome smell sickened me. The condition of the beds and patients was unspeakable. The one nurse slept in the bathroom, and the tub was filled with filthy rubbish." In fact, post-operative sepsis infection caused the death of almost half of patients undergoing major surgery. A common report by surgeons was, "Operation successful, but the patient died." The development of antisepsis, or antiseptics, created a major reduction in post-operative deaths and amputations during the 1870 to 1900 period. The central discoveries in the development of antiseptics were achieved soon after the Civil War by Joseph Lister, a surgeon at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and in 1879 Listerine mouthwash was named after him, a brand still widely sold today. Lister realized that airborne germs could cause putrefaction in wounds, and he concluded that the germs on the wound had to be destroyed during the operation itself, choosing carbolic acid as his initial antiseptic. This proved insufficient, and over the next few decades, new methods of sterilization were developed for the surgeon's hands, instruments, gloves, and clothing. The central role of infection in hospital deaths is symbolized by the 1881 death of President Garfield by an assassin's bullet. Expert doctors were said to have probed for the bullet using their fingers and unsterilized instruments, and Garfield's death from secondary infection followed soon after. The hospital in that period was not central to the practice of medicine, and in the middle and upper classes, sickness was endured at home in the presence of traveling doctors. Even victims of railroad, streetcar, and horse cart accidents were largely taken to their homes rather than to hospitals. Summarizing the contemporary attitude toward hospitals, A columnist in the Boston Evening Transcript wrote in 1888, "There is something about this all-pervading presence of sickness with a large S, this atmosphere of death, either just expected or just escaped, and all of this amiable perfunctoriness of nursing and medical attendance that is simply horrible. The hospital gives only sickness to think about, morning, noon, and night." In that era, hospitals were supported not by financial contributions from the poor or the government, but rather by voluntary philanthropy of the wealthy and sponsorship by religious orders and ethnic associations. Doctors whose main income came from private practice worked almost gratis in hospitals to gain experience and knowledge of difficult cases that they might not see in their rounds of in-home visits. A major problem for hospitals in the late 19th century was that although they might be reviled by the middle and upper classes, the free food and bed and care that they offered were very attractive to poor people, and policies had to be established, and often changed, regarding the maximum length of a hospital stay. Free patients stayed on an average of 5 weeks in the late 1870s. The small role of the late 19th century hospital for childbirth was consistent with its minimal role in health defined more broadly. 19th century maternity hospitals were urban asylums for the poor, homeless, or working-class married women who could not deliver at home, but who doctors and philanthropists believed deserved medical treatment. Though in 1900 only 5% of American women delivered their babies in hospitals, the gradual conquest of in-hospital puerperal fever slowly changed the public's perception of hospitals as a place to give birth. By 1921, more than half the births in many major U.S. cities took place in hospitals, as women came to view hospital births as safer, and as procedures were developed, such as the cesarean section, which occurred first in 1894, that could not be performed at home. By 1939, half of all women and 75% of urban women were delivering in hospitals. And by 1960, the percentage of all women had reached 95%. As Rose Kennedy is said to have remarked, the fashion changed. An early step in the transformation of hospitals was achieved by the formation of the first nursing schools in the 1870s. Previously, nursing had been considered to be at the same low level of social status as household cleaning women. The number of nursing training schools grew from 3 in 1873 to 432 by 1900, and 1,129 by 1910. By the early 20th century, the development of medical technology began to attract patients from the more comfortable income classes, both because antiseptics and increased cleanliness had made hospitals less fearsome, and because hospitals could now perform surgical and other procedures that could not be done at home. By the 1920s, the occupational distribution of patients in hospitals was similar to the population as a whole. Where only 20 or 30 years before there had been noise, dirt, and disarray, there was now, by 1910, control and organization. The rustle of the nurse's uniform, the bell of the telegraph, the rattle of the hydraulic elevator, the hiss of steam, the murmured ritual of the operating room. Digitalis, quinine, and mercury gave promise of relief to patients, while morphine, opium, cocaine, and sulfonal reduced the noisy manifestations of pain. The fetid smell of festering wounds had been banished with antiseptics and unrelenting cleanliness. Doctors performing services in hospitals billed the patient an extra fee beyond the hospital's own charges while continuing to donate time to care for the indigent, and a greater load of poor patients would cause a doctor to raise fees for paying patients to compensate for his time. Hospitals began to organize their beds into first class and steerage, reserving private or semi-private rooms for the paying patients and charity wards for the non-paying indigent. Further segregation separated black from white patients and victims of venereal diseases from otherwise similar patients who suffered from other types of ailments. Hospital finance began to change toward the modern American system based on health insurance, which began in the first decade of the 20th century in the form of workers' compensation for industrial accidents. Encouraged by President Theodore Roosevelt, workers' compensation paid the cost of care for injured workers by levies on firms, and by 1919, a majority of states had such systems. By modern standards, hospital care was still extremely cheap, with a room rate, excluding hospital and doctor charges for procedures, of $10 per week, common in the decade before World War I. After adjusting for inflation, the room rate comes out at $170 per week in 2013 dollars. The cost of a birth, including hospital room rates, fees for doctors and nurses, and extra hospital charges, could amount to between $50 and $300 in current prices by 1923. Part of this surge in hospital rates was a result of the economy-wide doubling of the price level that occurred during World War I. In New York City, by 1920, hospital rooms had reached $5 per day. The shift to childbirth in hospitals had two desirable side effects. It is no coincidence that the period of rapid decline of infant mortality between 1890 and 1950 coincided with the nearly complete shift from home births to hospital maternity wards. The second effect was the substitution effect of the relatively high cost of hospital care, which changed household decision-making in the direction of having fewer children, thus lowering the birth rate. Midwives had been a much less expensive choice than hospital care and continued to be preferred by immigrant women. But by the 1930s, they were no longer an option. As elderly midwives retired or died, a new generation failed to replace them, both because there were other better-paying options for native-born women and because the inflow of young foreign midwives had been cut off by the restrictive Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924. The 1920s were the heyday of the construction of hospitals, and the inflation-adjusted spending on hospital construction would not exceed the rate of the late 1920s until the mid-1950s. The consumer standard of living was boosted not just by the decline in both infant and adult mortality, but also by the increase in comfort made possible by the newly constructed hospitals. Privacy was a new commodity of great value, and new hospitals in 1928 devoted 46% of their beds to private rooms, 23% to semi-private rooms, 21% to small wards, and only 7% to large wards. The lack of privacy in wards and the difficulty of having private time to talk to visitors added to the determination of middle and upper-income patients to pay for the best, the private room, which reinforced the social segregation within the hospital that had developed since the late 19th century. By 1926, 6,800 institutions were classified as hospitals within the United States. Of these, 44% maintained clinical laboratories, and 41% had X-ray departments. About 28% of these hospitals were owned by federal, state, or local government, and the remaining 72% were divided among church-run, individually or partnership-owned, and independent, i.e. nonprofit, institutions. Medical research, medical schools, and the transformation of medical knowledge. Medical knowledge advanced slowly but steadily before 1940. The elements of surgery and the use of ether as an anesthetic were developed before the Civil War, and research on the use of anesthesia, including ether, chloroform, and even cocaine, continued after the Civil War. In the late 19th century, techniques were developed to use anesthesia in surgery, to remove gallstones, and to treat appendicitis, heart murmurs, and liver disease. Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and Robert Koch have been described as the remarkable trio who transformed modern medicine. Although individuals such as Pasteur and Koch often get credit for individual cures, progress was a team effort as scientists from the United States and several European countries replicated and improved on the early experiments. Though some doctors welcomed these new discoveries, others did not, and were often hostile to the germ theory of disease. It was not unusual for well-known physicians to get up and leave the hall when medical papers were being read which emphasized the germ theory of disease. They wanted to express their contemptuous scorn for such theories and refused to listen to them. Because of warring factions and different philosophies of medical science, the history of medical schools in the 19th century is a tale of schisms, conspiracies, and coups, often destroying the institutions in the process. Part of the deep division resulted from widespread acceptance of homeopathy, not just skepticism about the germ theory. Other reasons for the hostility was a widespread suspicion of science, a refusal to believe that widespread epidemics could be caused by nearly invisible microorganisms, and the threat to physicians' expertise in prescribing the palliative drugs available at the time. Nevertheless, the development of vaccines gradually converted the doubters, and the first benefits from the germ theory came from an increased emphasis on cleanliness and sterilization, as well as the spreading of knowledge about what true sterilization required in doctors' offices and hospitals. Homeopathic medical theories were increasingly rejected, and homeopathic medical schools had almost disappeared by 1920. The state of medical and scientific knowledge includes the condition of medical schools. There were only 60 medical schools in 1870, and all but the best had a short and shoddy program of instruction. A medical degree could be earned in 2 years of 18 weeks each. The schools were weak to non-existent on the basic disciplines of anatomy and physiology, and also lacked clinical training. What they taught was the middle slice of a modern medical school, the how-to techniques of medical diagnosis and procedure. For most medical schools, there was no admissions requirements, and no grades were given in courses. In contrast were the high standards of the Johns Hopkins Hospital and Johns Hopkins Medical School, founded respectively in 1889 and 1893. In the late 19th century, medical education was dominated by for-profit diploma mills that turned out nothing more than warm bodies with diplomas. In addition, many pretenders displayed invalid medical certificates. By the end of the 19th century, a degree in medicine could be obtained for between $5 and $10. Its cost, depending on the quality of the paper on which the diploma was printed. These certificates were not too expensive even for the most poverty-stricken quack. One of the great milestones in the history of American medicine was the publication of the Flexner Report in 1910, a report that the American Medical Association, which realized that it could not enter such controversial territory directly, had commissioned to be carried out by the prestigious Carnegie Foundation of the Advancement of Teaching. The young educator Abraham Flexner visited all of the nation's medical schools and was welcomed by each, the institution thinking that the visit might be an inspection in advance of a Carnegie financial contribution. But invitations expecting a financial gift were shocked later to learn that the report questioned the necessity of their very existence. Flexner's report complained, "The professor lectures to ill-prepared students for 1 hour a few times weekly. Private quizmasters drill hundreds of students in memorizing minute details that they would be unable to navigate if the objects were before them." Flexner devastated the claims of legitimacy of the private for-profit schools, showing that touted laboratories consisted of a few vagrant test tubes squirreled away in a cigar box. Corpses reeked because of the failure to use disinfectant in the dissecting rooms. Libraries had no books. Alleged faculty members were busily occupied in private practice. Flexner's recommendations administered a guillotine to much of American medical education. The top schools, such as Johns Hopkins and Harvard, should be strengthened. A few of the best medical schools should aspire to top status, and the rest of the medical school industry should be shut down. And indeed, many did shut down, and with a lag, this reduced the number of doctors per person, as we saw in Figure 7.5. How did patients pay for medical care? In the earlier era lasting until 1910 or 1920, medical costs were not an important issue. Most medical service was dispensed by doctors making house calls, and the doctor's charge for a home visit was often very low by any subsequent standard, with an extra charge for mileage traveled. The interval 1905 to 20 was the heyday of the itinerant doctor traveling in his new automobile, especially in rural America. Doctors provided whatever service they could in the home and did not send patients to hospitals, in part because the latter were few and far between. By the 1920s, the majority of doctors were organized into individual practices, charging fees for service on a patient-by-patient basis, and without any formal salaried connection with a hospital. House calls continued, and it was estimated that in 1925, 2/3 of patients disabled by illness were being treated in their homes by doctors and the remainder inside the hospitals. Cooperation between primary doctors and specialists was uncoordinated and primitive, the very opposite of the goal of today's healthcare with electronic medical records covering all aspects of a patient's care. Patients could drop into a specialist's office without any contact with or referral from a primary physician, and they had to pay out of pocket for that specialist's service. The cost of medical treatment rose inexorably after 1910. Part of the cause was the reform of medical schools, which raised the cost of going to medical school and hence caused doctors' charges to rise to create sufficient incentives to attract students to medical schools. Licensing of doctors created a quasi-monopoly that boosted physician charges. The rise of the American hospital after 1900 brought with it new financial problems for patients. An increasing fraction of medical ailments were treated using X-rays and other modern equipment. As infectious diseases were conquered, the remaining set of health problems increasingly required access to specialists. Costs to patients increased because specialists charged more than general practitioners, because hospitals were increasingly used as a replacement for house calls in patients' homes, and because the charge for cure of a particular ailment increasingly required payment to multiple providers. In some instances, there might be 8 or 10 separate charges, one each from the family physician and several specialists, one or more from laboratory tests, another from the hospital for room and board, one or more from nurses, still another for nurses' board, and extra charges for the anesthetics, operating room, and medicine. How then did patients pay for this increasingly complex medical system? In some cases, doctors were willing to adjust their fees by charging more to the rich and less to the poor, but they faced a basic handicap in that they had no independent method of verifying their patients' family income. A contemporary source listed 7 different ways in which patients responded to the high cost of medical care in the mid-1920s. 1. Free dispensaries and clinics. 2. Generously provided free care provided by the family physician. 3. Willingness to pay the doctor's bill as a matter of pride. 4. Available but inadequate medical insurance provided by fraternal orders and some trade unions, as well as workmen compensation and commercial providers. 5. Avoidance of treatment by poor people, contributing to their higher death rates. 6. Patronization of quack doctors and other non-professionals. And 7. Self-treatment with potions and patent medicines. To the extent that commercial health insurance was available, it suffered from all the abuses of modern health insurance, including cream skimming to find the healthiest patients, age limitations to avoid insuring the old, medical exams to detect pre-existing conditions, and a reluctance to insure the lower classes, who were predicted to have greater exposure to infectious diseases and other ailments. Notably absent from the list of 7 was any comprehensive form of health insurance, which had been part of Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party platform in the 1912 presidential election campaign. The platform promised, quote, protection of home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through the adoption of a system of social insurance adopted to American use." End quote. Roosevelt's loss to Woodrow Wilson in that election was followed by 5 years of legislative struggle between advocates of universal health care and an unlikely set of opponents, including doctors, pharmacists, employers, and even labor unions. The proponents suggested as their model the comprehensive social insurance programs initiated by Germany in 1883, the United Kingdom in 1911, and in many other European countries in between. As with the European plans, the Roosevelt idea was not just to cover medical costs, but also to alleviate poverty by compensating income lost as a result of illness. A contemporary survey of 4,500 workers in a Chicago working-class neighborhood revealed that over the previous year, 1 in 4 had lost at least 1 week's wages because of sickness. And for this group, 13.6% of annual income was lost. Noting the failure of even a single state to introduce health insurance, a proponent in 1917 lamented, "We are still so far from considering illness as anything beyond a private misfortune against which each individual and each family should protect itself, as best it may, that Germany's heroic method of attacking it as a national evil through government machinery seems to us to belong almost to another planet." The early forms of health insurance, often called sickness funds, date back to the 1890s and became more common during the progressive era of 1900 to 1920. A 1917 estimate for 3 industrial states indicated that fully a third of the non-agricultural workforce had some form of health insurance, consisting of sickness funds established by fraternal organizations, firms, unions, as well as privately purchased insurance. Nationwide coverage reached perhaps half of the 1/3 estimate, taking lower coverage of farmers, farm workers, and non-agricultural workers in the southern states into account. Increasing average costs during the 1920s were only part of the problem of financing medical care, for the increasing capability of hospitals to treat complex diseases greatly increased the variability of charges. Though illnesses that required hospitalization were still relatively uncommon, members of the middle class unlucky enough to suffer from prolonged hospital stays could expect to receive bills equal to 1/3 or half their annual income. A national commission reported in 1930 that 3.5% of the families who had the largest medical bills paid 1/3 of the cost of medical care in the nation. The risk of uninsured charges equal to such a large portion of income naturally raised the demand for health insurance. A fraction of American workers was covered by industrial sickness funds. Leaving aside their limited coverage, these funds were tied to employment, just as is modern American health insurance. Thus, unemployment resulting from the macroeconomic disaster of the Great Depression caused workers to lose both their income and their health insurance. This double dose of bad luck was aggravated by the tendency of employers to choose to fire those employees who were in poor health. Because the unhealthy workers had been weeded out of employment and were no longer covered by the sickness funds, the remaining members of the sickness funds were healthier than normal, thus reducing the coverage costs of the funds. This led to the absurd claim that the Great Depression improved the health of the average insured worker. There was no organized effort to achieve national health insurance during Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, despite its achievement of compulsory unemployment compensation and Social Security. The most plausible explanations were the uncompromising opposition of the American Medical Association and the tendency of FDR to follow public opinion rather than to lead it. In fact, Roosevelt responded to the fierce lobbying opposition to universal health care by omitting it from the Social Security legislation, for fear that government-guaranteed old-age pensions would flounder in Congress unless medical care was omitted from the bill. Death from Accidents and Homicides. The title of this chapter, Nasty, Brutish, and Short, refers initially to the causes of death involving diseases that led to short lives and nasty deaths. At least these deaths were gradual as the disease progressed, allowing young and old alike to say goodbye to their family members. But other deaths were brutish, not allowing for a prolonged goodbye. These included deaths from accidents that occurred incidental to industrial jobs, deaths from railway accidents that killed workers, passengers, and pedestrians, deaths from automobile accidents, and deaths from homicide. Edison's October 1879 invention of the electric light was heralded not just for the brightness and reliability of the light, but also for the ease of turning it on and off in comparison to the provision era of gas and kerosene lamps. But few accounts of the benefits of Edison's invention include the saving of lives previously lost before 1879 because of the much greater safety of electric light. Every year in the U.S. alone, 5,000 to 6,000 people a year died in lamp accidents due to adulterated oil, clumsiness, and carelessness, spills and breakages, or someone leaving a lamp too near to curtains or bedclothes, failing to lower the wick before blowing out the light, or trying to extinguish a lamp by blowing down the chimney. Deaths and injuries in the workplace were at levels that seem nearly inconceivable today. President Harrison was quoted in 1892 as saying, "American workmen are subjected to peril of life and limb as great as a soldier in time of war." Indeed, deaths caused by American railroads in the 3 years 1898 to 1900 to employees, passengers, and collisions with horses and people were roughly equal to British Army losses in the 3-year Boer War. The peak for railroad-related fatalities was 11,800 in 1907, and Figure 76 shows that this amounted in that year to 138 per million members of the population. The rate declined rapidly to 35 in 1940, and to less than 10 after 1970. Injuries, shown on the right scale, peaked at 2,060 per million, and thereafter declined even more quickly than deaths, reaching 224 in 1940. After a temporary bulge in World War II, because of the extremely high utilization of the railway network, both railroad fatalities and injuries faded away almost to nothing after 1980. The United States was unique in its high fatality rate in the early 20th century. The average U.S. rate in the years 1911 to 15 was more than 6 times as high as contemporary rates registered by Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom. One reason for the higher fatality rate in the United States than in Europe was a difference in standards of construction, thanks to the high cost of capital, low population density, and thin traffic on given lines. Most railroads in Europe were built from the start, with grade separations, so that road traffic flowed over or under the railroad tracks. In contrast, most American railroads were built at grade level, except in major cities and on some suburban railroads. British railroad bridges were built with iron, whereas many American bridges were built with wood. Furthermore, paved roads were much more developed in Europe, whereas in the United States the narrow dirt roads were dusty in summer and mud-caked in winter, offering circuitous routings between towns and cities. The straight lines followed by railroad tracks tempted many travelers to hop a freight train or just walk along the tracks, thus exposing themselves to danger. In European railway stations, fences and platforms prevented passengers or greeters from walking onto the track, but this was less true with the open design of American railway stations, which often consisted of little more than a small structure next to a track. Gradually, railway safety improved, as shown by the declining fatality and injury rates displayed in Figure 76. Better brakes, couplers, and other safety equipment, heavier and better constructed tracks and wheels, together with a gradual transition from manual to automatic signals, had virtually eliminated collisions by 1929. Deaths of railroad employees, which had reached a high of 3,400 in 1910, gradually fell as equipment was made safer, and committees of employees made recommendations for changes in practices and educating workers as to the dangers of particular operations. Competition from automobiles and buses decimated short-haul railroad passenger traffic, leading to a shift from relatively dangerous rural tracks and stations to better designed urban and suburban infrastructure. Railroads are singled out in this section because they caused death and injuries not just among their employees, but also among passengers, pedestrians, and people, horses, and vehicles at grade crossings. Death to passengers came not just from rail travel, but also from ships. Only 8 years before the massive loss of life in the Titanic sinking, a 3-deck paddle steamer named the General Slocum headed up the East River carrying hundreds of German immigrants who had spent the day at a floating party. A fire broke out, and oil tanks exploded, engulfing the boat in flames. As a result of bolted-down lifeboats and rotting life jackets, of the 1,300 passengers, more than 1,000 died. And in 1915 on the Chicago River, the Eastland, about to depart for a party voyage of Western Electric employees, capsized, killing 844 passengers. These were only 2 of the most notorious of the shipping incidents in American waters that reflected poor safety precautions and ship design. Railroad fatalities soon faded into insignificance compared to motor vehicle fatalities. The absolute number of motor vehicle fatalities first exceeded railroad deaths in 1918 and had doubled railroad deaths by 1921. The ratio of vehicle fatalities per 100 million miles traveled hits its peak of 45 as early as 1909, and by 1922 had already fallen by half to 22 and again by half to 11 by 1939. The rate in 2008 was only 1.3. Smaller by a factor of 10 than in 1939, and by a factor of 40 than in 1909. This is an example of rapid progress both before and after 1940. An apparent fan of George and Ira Gershwin noted that the automobile is here to slay. Initially, in the first years after its 1900 introduction, the automobile did not travel much faster than a horse and broke down frequently, creating few accidents. But as automobile speeds increased, so did the risk of danger. Roads were narrow and rutted, and children played in the streets and became victims of automobiles. Early cars had weak brakes, tires that blew out, headlights that glared, plate glass windows that made them easy to flip. No seatbelts and often soft roofs, or no roofs at all. There were no driver's education requirements, no driving exams, no vision tests, no age limits, and in most places, no speed limits. During much of the past century, deaths from homicides have been roughly half as frequent as those from automobile fatalities. Figure 77 displays the rate per 100,000 people of homicides from 1900 to 2010, which exhibits cycles rather than a single downward or upward trend. The overall pattern is of a U, with wide tails before 1933 and after 1970, and a sharply diminished homicide rate between the early 1930s and late 1960s. There were 2 peaks in the homicide rate, one coinciding with the end of Prohibition in 1933, and the second at the peak of drug violence in 1980. Homicides declined by more than half from 1933 to the mid-1950s, when the rate was equal to that of 1907 to 10. Then they rose again to a peak in the 1980s, a bit higher than in the 1930s. By 2008, the rate had declined substantially, though not to the low levels of the 1950s. The absolute number of homicides in the early 1930s was about a third of motor vehicle deaths at the same time and similar to railroad-related deaths in 1917 to 18. What stood out was that the homicide rate in the United States was 7 to 10 times higher than in any European country in the early 20th century. Homicide incidents, unlike the occurrence of railroad or motor fatalities, was not uniformly spread across the United States. In fact, in 1900, New England had a homicide rate similar to Old England. Homicide rates by state show a sharp geographical distribution, with New England joined by the northern states along the Canadian border, west of Wisconsin, all having very low homicide rates, while the highest rates were found in the southern tier of states, led by Louisiana. In 2007, African Americans were homicide victims at almost 10 times the rate of whites, and both blacks and whites in the South were more violent than their counterparts in the North. Black-on-white homicides relative to white-on-white homicides in New York City rose from 3 times as many to 13 times as many between 1850 and 1950. In Steven Pinker's interpretation, democracy came too early to America, in contrast to Europe, where the state had long ago disarmed the people and acquired a monopoly on violence as a method of policing. The extreme was the American South, where a reliance on self-help justice to settle disputes and achieve retaliation was preferred to strong government-based policing. In turn, Pinker traces the Southern culture back to the different origins of immigrants to the North and South, where Southerners in the mountainous frontier away from the coastal plantations mainly came from the Scottish Irish, who arrived from the mountainous frontier of the British Isles. But even the South was no match for homicide rates with the western frontier towns, where death rates per 100,000 could reach 100, in contrast to the rate of 1 in 1900 England or 7 for the United States in 1925 or 2008. Pinker attributes this anarchy and mayhem to a lack of law enforcement, the ready availability of guns, a culture dominated by young men aged 15 to 30, facing a scarcity of the civilizing influence of women, and the ubiquity of alcohol. Eventually, the savagery of violence in the West declined as cities grew and women arrived. But the cultural uniqueness of the American South and the disproportionate homicide rates of black men killing black victims remains to this day. This history of black-on-black homicides unfortunately moved north with the Great Migration to industrial cities, such as Chicago and Detroit, particularly during the periods of labor shortage during World War I and World War II. The most valuable improvement of all? Valuing higher life expectancy. A consistent theme of this book is that the major inventions and their subsequent complementary innovations increased the quality of life, far more than their contributions to market-produced GDP. The national accounts dutifully record expenditures on automobiles and related services, attempting imperfectly to correct for quality changes. But in the case of the invention of motor vehicles, the GDP accounts do not include the health and aesthetic benefits of the retirement of the horse and its indiscriminate dropping of manure and urine on the urban streets, not to mention the role of the automobile in creating an entire new category of consumption known as personal travel. Every invention has generated unmeasured benefits or consumer surplus. But no improvement matches the welfare benefits of the decline in mortality and increase in life expectancy examined in previous sections of this chapter. Over the past 3 decades, economists have developed methods of placing a monetary value on gains in longevity. If greater longevity raises GDP and the population in proportion, real GDP per capita does not change. But each individual is better off because he or she has more years to enjoy that standard of living. Spouses have more years to enjoy their marriage partner instead of spending years in widowhood, while children have more years to share parental advice and affection. In a term used by Gary Becker and co-authors, full income refers to both market-based income produced per year and the monetary equivalent of changes in the number of years over which that income can be enjoyed. The monetary valuation of increased life expectancy should not be viewed, contrary to Nordhaus's suggestion, as a measure of the output of healthcare industry. As we have seen, the healthcare industry contributed little to the epochal decline in mortality between 1890 and 1950. Most of the credit is allocated above to developments outside that industry, including the arrival of clean running water and sanitary sewer pipes, reduction in food contamination and adulteration achieved by everything from refrigerated railroad cars to food and drug regulation, and the development of the Pasteur germ theory, with its subsequent emphasis on controlling insects, achieving cleanliness, and changing attitudes about the breastfeeding of infants. The estimation of the monetary value of an additional life year made possible by decreased mortality has been developed most recently by William Nordhaus in one study and by Kevin Murphy and Robert Topel in another. Their technique shares the aim of measuring the value of an additional life year by which to multiply the savings in life years implied by historical mortality tables. To simplify this section, we present only the results obtained by Nordhaus. The Nordhaus calculations of the value of improved health provide 4 alternative estimates that are sufficiently similar that we average their values in translating his conclusions in Figure 7.8. Nordhaus expresses the value of health improvements as a share of conventional consumer expenditures, and we adjust his estimates to express them as a share of GDP. As shown, the Nordhaus calculations imply that the value of improvements in life expectancy during 1900 to 1950 was as large as the growth rate of real GDP per capita for all other reasons. Thus, he doubles the growth in potential GDP per capita from 2.05% per year to 4.2% per year. For 1950 through 2000, the value of increased longevity was 63% of the growth in the rest of GDP. Post-war growth, including his health capital estimates, was 3.5%, compared to the conventional 2.1%. The most important conclusion to be reached from the Nordhaus study is that the health-augmented growth rate of real GDP per capita in the first half of the 20th century was substantially higher than in the second half. Though the official measures suggest that growth was about 0.1% slower in the first half, the Nordhaus estimate suggests 0.7% faster. This result agrees with a central theme of this book, that the growth rate of welfare in the first half of the 20th century has been significantly understated relative to the second half, and this conclusion makes no allowance for the enormous amounts of consumer surplus contributed by the other inventions considered in chapters 3 through 6, including the benefits from electrification, motor vehicles, information, and entertainment. Conclusion. During the 1870 to 1940 interval covered by this chapter, the public health and medical community came close to winning 2 enormous victories, against infant mortality in particular, and against infectious diseases more generally. The rate of improvement in life expectancy at birth in the first half of the 20th century was double the rate of improvement in the last half of the 20th century. The sense of progress in 1926 was palpable in the sense that there was a great gap between what the medical community knew how to cure and actual medical outcomes. A comprehensive 1927 book on the state of American medicine provided this double-edged verdict. That knowledge is at hand to prevent much of the suffering and premature death caused by disease is avowed by well-known leaders in the field of medicine. The health field has a woefully ineffective distribution service as compared with its marvelously effective production service in the laboratories of the world. We know how to do a lot of things which we don't do, or do on a wretchedly small scale. First rank among the causes of progress during 1890 to 1940 is awarded to urban sanitation infrastructure, the network of pipes bringing clean running water under pressure into the home, and the different set of sanitary sewer pipes taking away the waste and effluent. The work of Cutler and Miller suggests that clean water may explain as much as 3/4 of the decline in infant mortality. Some caution is required because deaths from non-waterborne diseases declined as quick as or quicker than those from waterborne infections. Some credits should be given to other factors that reduced the spread of infectious diseases. including knowledge at the level of households about cleanliness and breastfeeding, the role of refrigeration and federal regulation in reducing food adulteration and contamination, the invention of window screens, and the transition during 1900 to 1930 from horses, with their excrement and dead carcasses, to motor vehicles. Not just clean water, but also uncontaminated milk, contributed to the decline of infant mortality. Adulteration of milk was more common in cities, where parents bought milk from vendors, than on farms, where the milk came from the farmer's own cows or nearby sources. The reform movement calling for public health regulation that culminated in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 had as its target not only adulterated and contaminated milk, but also meat slaughtered in unsanitary conditions. The purification of the milk supply is an important explanation of the timing of changes in infant mortality, which declined most rapidly in the 3 decades between 1880 and 1910. Advances within the healthcare sector can be divided between research, hospitals, and doctors. The single most important advance in medical science was the Pasteur germ theory of disease, which by the 1880s and 1890s had led to the identification of insects and bacteria responsible for most of the infectious diseases that had caused a majority of the deaths in the late 19th century. Increased belief by doctors and public health officials in the validity of the germ theory spurred the advances of urban sanitation infrastructure and the regulation of food and drugs. But medical science itself contributed relatively little to the decline in mortality before 1920. Progress was made mainly in the surgical area through the development of anesthetics and antiseptics that made the process of surgery much less painful and less likely to result in death through infection. The foundations of future advances were put in place before 1920, however, with the inventions of the electrocardiogram, X-ray machine, and other basic tools for modern medicine. In previous chapters on food, clothing, the networked house, electrification, motor vehicles, and communication, as well as entertainment, the United States established the frontier of invention, innovation, and progress after 1870. But American exceptionalism was not entirely a virtue. We have seen in this chapter that American cities provided water and sewer pipes 2 or 3 decades later than the large cities in Western Europe. The most important negative feature of American exceptionalism was the inability of the political system to adopt universal health insurance, defined as insurance that is a right of citizenship rather than being dependent on employment. Why should households suffering from the devastating loss of income through unemployment also lose their access to what should be a universal right, the ability to obtain healthcare services to prevent diseases and ultimately death? Bismarck figured out this greatest of all economic policy issues in the 1880s. But even now, an efficient system of the provision of medical care as a right of citizenship has thus far eluded the American political system.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.